Hi, my name is Theophilus Engeler, and I'm a member of the recently formed national political party, Australian Christians. As a candidate for the upcoming federal election, I'm often confronted with questions of concern from both Christians and non-Christians about the legitimacy of Christian influence and involvement in politics, and about the nature and role of a Christian political party in Australia. I would like to build a case for Christian influence in government from three distinct perspectives. Firstly, for Christians, I really want to impress on you that the authority of Scripture provides a clear biblical sanction for Christian influence and involvement in government. Secondly, for secular audiences, I want to demonstrate that basic democratic principles provide an unambiguous platform for the formation of a Christian party. And finally, for both Christian and non-Christian audiences, I want to argue that real practical issues today provide a clear moral imperative for Christian values to be heard in the public debate. So I'm going to make a biblical argument, a philosophical argument, and a practical argument for why you should vote for Australian Christians at the 2013 federal election. If I convince you, I will finish off by outlining the types of support we need and suggest some ways that you and your church can get involved. The biblical argument is based on the authority of Scripture, but Christians in Australia generally struggle to know conclusively whether it is legitimate for Christians to be involved in politics at all, and if so, to what extent. But I want to show you that there are clear biblical teachings that condone and encourage Christian influence and involvement in government, and then also show you some clear biblical examples of faithful intervention in the political process. Well, the Bible has a lot to say about civil government. Many scriptures show that civil government is a gift from God, ordained by God, subject to God's rule, and used by God for His purposes. After all, it is God's prerogative to use both the church and civil government as His instruments for fulfilling His purposes for this world. Chapter 13 of Paul's letter to the Romans explains that government officials are God's servants for our good. But ask yourself, how can these officials effectively serve God if no one can tell them what they believe God expects of them? If we really believe 1 Peter chapter 2 that the role of government is to punish evil and reward good, then as Christians we can't detach the role of government from the moral principles taught in the Bible. And we should also not shy away from presenting these biblical moral principles as part of the public debate. If we really believe Daniel chapter 4, that God rules supreme over the kingdom of men and gives it to whom He pleases and sets over it lowly people, then as Christians we can no longer wash our hands of the role that God has assigned to us, to administer justice and to defend the vulnerable. In addition to the direct teaching on this matter, the Bible also provides numerous clear examples of faithful people influencing and instructing the civil and military rulers of their day. Joseph's key role as the de facto prime minister to Pharaoh and Daniel's central advisory role to King Nebuchadnezzar are two detailed Old Testament examples. There is also the example of Mordecai and Queen Esther being divinely used by God to save His chosen people Israel. Furthermore, we can look at the host of prophecies and admonitions to Gentile nations contained in the books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Nahum, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah. In the New Testament, John the Baptist clearly directs Herod in Luke chapter 3, and Paul likewise instructs the Roman governor Felix in Acts chapter 24. I hope you will agree with me that the role of Christians in government is clearly advocated for in Scripture, both in principle and by example. Now, the philosophical argument is based on democratic principles and the theory of democracy. And this is probably quite a clear argument that not too many people in Australia would struggle with. The idea that a significant constituency within the Australian population deserves to be represented in Parliament, it just seems self-evident to us. Christians obviously make up a significant percentage of the Australian population, and I believe it is entirely appropriate that our values and interests are represented in parliaments in the same way that environmentalists, business groups, the unions, and others are likewise represented. Where the theory of democracy sometimes appears to conflict with Christian influence in government is in the notion of a separation of church and state. There is a modern paranoia that somehow the church will usurp democratic power and relaunch a modern-day Spanish Inquisition on non-Christians. We've probably all heard the mantra, "Don't legislate morality." Well, I think it is time for some rational analysis of this phobia in our society. The idea that it is somehow dangerous for our morality to influence our laws is simply ignoring the reality that this is in fact an inseparable part of our legal heritage and something to be preserved. This is a big issue for secular society, and I address this in further detail in a separate episode. Nevertheless, I will briefly state that our aim to introduce biblical morality to the public debate and to the political process does not establish Christianity any more than legislating against theft, for example, based on a Christian conviction. This notion that Christians should be quiet and private about their beliefs really discriminates between religion and ideology as legitimate values among the voting public. Do we really want a political climate in Australia where a communist's ideology to abolish private property is considered legitimate, but the protection of private property, advocated on the grounds of biblical teaching about theft, is ruled out? Finally, I would like to point out that the very notion of the separation of church and state was always meant to protect the church from the power of government, not to protect government from the power of the church. In addition to the secular and scriptural arguments I've just outlined, there is a third practical argument which is based on actual pressing needs in society and in the political environment today. Firstly, I would suggest that values-based politicians would be a welcome change to the current world of career politicians driven by populist sentiments as reflected in opinion polls. After all, we really do believe that biblical morality and the gospel offers good news and real practical solutions to a hurting world. The second important reason for a Christian party, based on practical pressing needs, is to offset the extreme radical influence of liberal parties like the Greens. Because of the bitterly divided world of Australian politics, the Australian Christians Party would only need a few senators elected in order to hold the balance of power. Finally, a Christian party is needed now to address the great moral crises of our generation. Vital issues like the sanctity of life, the protection of the traditional family, and ensuring religious freedom needs to be addressed now, and Australian Christians, with God's grace, is prepared to raise the difficult issues. Now, if you are convinced of the need for a Christian party in Australia, we need your support. We need votes, volunteers, members, candidates for local seats, fundraisers, and prayer. Please follow the link below to the Australian Christians website and sign up for membership or contact our office. May God bless you and your family, and may His grace be on all of us to fulfill His righteous plans.